Welcome to the Psychology of True Crime with me, RC. Sometimes the most painful truth isn't found in what someone says, but in who they stop speaking to. After Dan Markel's death, something quiet and complicated unfolded, a total emotional cutoff between Wendi Adelson and the Markel family. Today, we're not accusing anyone. We're looking at the psychology behind why someone erases an entire family after tragedy. From a clinical point of view, several forces may have driven her to create emotional and physical distance from the Markel family. In this video, I will highlight them as I move through each of her 4 testimonies and how alienation kept on going from a psychological perspective, which will show and explain the behavior. For Wendi Adelson, the death of Dan Markel wasn't just a loss of an ex-husband. It was the end of every unfinished argument, every resentment, every identity shift she had been holding on to. Dan's death created a deep inner conflict. She had long viewed him as a source of stress and containment, and his family embodied his identity, values, and legacy. To engage with the Markels would mean confronting the reality of his death, her complicated role in their fractured family system, the empathy and the guilt expected in normal grief were devoid. Distancing, however, created a psychological shortcut. If she avoids them, she doesn't have to face the parts of herself which can be tied to them. So she created emotional disruption, identity protection, and early distancing actually right after the memorial in Tallahassee. According to Wendi, the visit stopped in 2016. That's when one of the hitmen was arrested. She claimed she feared the Markels would place her children in foster care. That was her reasoning for cutting the Markels off. In her earliest testimony, Wendi appears rooted in narratives of conflict, frustration, and emotional burnout. Psychologically, this is consistent with someone processing the overload of a dissolved relationship. Keeping strong focus on difficulties, using that language that frames her as overwhelmed, emphasizing on wanting to move on, and the portrayal of the situation as unmanageable. In this initial phase, she uses cognitive distancing, creating verbal space between herself and emotionally charged decisions made during that period, which included the Markel family. Her tone is reminiscent of someone trying to create clarity for themselves. For example, she says, "Here's what my life felt like," and goes on to say, her job was to take care of the boys. Media coverage around the case kept her from employment. The reason why this is important is because this early distancing becomes a baseline from which every layer of testimony shifts, and she maintains her distance from the Markels, which moves us into identity protection. So, after the divorce, Wendi built a new narrative. She was the protective mother, Dan was the obstacle, relocation was about opportunity and being close to family. The Markels' involvement threatened the hero identity she crafted. Cutting them out, protecting the story she tells herself. Selective recall, emotional compartmentalization is what this is called. By the time of her second testimony in 2022, a noticeable pattern emerges. Wendi begins to frame more events as things she doesn't really remember. For example, when asked, "Where does Josh Stone teach?" A character from her book, she says she doesn't remember. It was written a long time ago. Or when asked, "Does your family own any properties?" she responds with, "I didn't know then, but I know now. I wasn't involved in their business." This is like coming to a no U turn sign, but making a double U turn and saying, "I didn't do anything wrong." Psychologically, this suggests stress based memory pruning, the mind cutting away details that feel heavy, narrative minimization, and adaptive forgetting, which is pr- which is a protective mechanism where the individual limits how much emotional or factual content they revisit. Her responses become shorter and her emotional expression flattens, a common sign of someone who is internally managing anxiety by simplifying the story. She appears calm, but the calm feels managed and unnatural, which moves us into the loyalty dynamics within her own family. Her parents, especially Donna Adelson, reportedly played a dominant role in her self image, her major life decisions, and the belief that our side is what's best for the children. Aligning with the Markels would mean breaking loyalty bonds with her own family. Choosing one side means rejecting the other. Once new information enters the public sphere, so does narrative realignment. Between testimony 2 and 3, the outside world changes. Arrests are made, evidence begins to pile up, and public theory begin shaping the perceptions. When external narratives grow louder, internal narratives often tighten. Here we see Wendi shifting from I don't remember to that wasn't my life. This is a psychological strategy called role minimization, which is reinforcing and particularly uninvolved in anything beyond her immediate responsibilities. Markers of this shift include repeated emphasis on not knowing, more careful word choices, and focusing heavily on her routines, children, and day to day tasks. This phase is marked by what psychology calls identity anchoring. When threatened, the mind clings to roles that feel safe, such as I'm a parent, a professional, a daughter, and retreats from anything that may feel destabilizing. Then comes the emotional avoidance as a coping mechanism. Grief from loss, or even relief from loss, can surface unbearable vulnerabilities, such as regret, responsibility, and memories, either good or bad. Some people cope not by processing emotions, but by eliminating the triggers of those emotions. The Markels equaled a permanent trigger. So she pushed them away, not because they didn't love her children, but because being around them made her feel discomfort. To minimize these triggers, she created emotional detachment, rehearsed stability, and narrative finalization. By the time she reaches her fourth testimony, Wendy's tone has hardened, not in a confrontational way, but in a resolved way. Psychological observations include extreme consistent phrasing. She has tighter emotional expressions, no more laughing, no more K turn hand movements. She increased the use of abstract language such as issues, problems, situations. We don't hear words such as I know or I feel. Instead, it's near total removal of personal sentiment from past events. This is the phase where her narrative becomes a practice shield, not necessarily deceptive, but protective. The story she tells now is in the tone and structure remarkably distant from her first testimony. It is less about her emotional journey and more about the version of events she appears committed to keeping stable. From a psychological perspective, this reflects long term narrative consolidation, defense against cognitive dissonance, and a firm commitment to the safest emotional position. Even during her police interview, Wendy kept bringing up her legal briefs, almost arguing them as if she was defending herself in a courtroom. But during Donna's trial, she spoke as someone who has rehearsed her emotional boundaries so thoroughly that revisiting the past no longer comes with internal conflict, which moves us into narrative control. Who controls the story controls the meaning. If the Markels remained, they could correct her version of events. They could influence the children's memory of their father. They could publicly question her decisions. Distance becomes a power strategy, a way to control the narrative of Dan's legacy and the children's identity. Wendy's alienation of the Markels can be understood as a multi layered defense. Avoid the pain, preserve the hero identity, protect the loyalty bond, and control the story. Is this healthy or moral? That's a question for you to answer. But psychologically, it is a predictable response. With survival, feels like rewriting reality. Isolation from Dan's family means she never has to face what they lost, what the children lost, or what role her family had. So avoidance becomes the primary coping mechanism. Children become the keepers of legacy. If they carry the Markel name, they carry Dan's side of the story. Altering the last name alienates the paternal side. What they learn about their may be filtered. Questions about why we don't see Dan's family may be redirected, and Dan's memory becomes optional. This is known as parental narrative domination. The parent decides what truths are kept and what truths are buried. So avoidance becomes her oxygen, distance becomes her stability, and the story she lives in becomes the story she tells. This is the psychology of true crime. Thank you for watching. Comment below and tell me what you see in this pattern. And I will catch you guys on the next one.